Hey everyone, welcome to our safety and equipment video. This first part of the video, I'm going to go around and show you all the different places in our classroom where our safety equipment is and give you an idea of the classroom. So let's get going. Alright, so here I have the front of the room. Hopefully you don't get too dizzy from all this. I'm going to start out in the back left corner here for probably the first place that you would visit if you were going to be doing a lab, and that is of course our goggle storage. So if I open that up, this is a sanitation kit here, so it uses a UV light. This is where all our goggles are stored. If you saw, I prefer to use this kind of goggles. We've got two different kinds. This kind is not as safe because it's not got the full sides going on. These are the most common ones, and these are definitely the safest because they go directly to your face and they have little vents if you need them. But yeah, I like to use a little bit of both, give you guys the options. So goggles, if you use them, you will take them from here and you will return them to our goggle storage so that we can clean them efficiently. Next up, right close by our goggle storage, around the corner here is the next stop you might make, and this is for our lovely aprons. Okay, our aprons, we've got two different sizes. We've got the small and the big. Most everybody's going to be using the small ones unless you want to make sure to be protecting your ankles. Those big ones can cover you. So you pretty much always have to use aprons in lab. There's very few instances where I will say, you don't need an apron this time. Okay, next up are the infamous eye wash stations. Okay, we've got our eye wash, so if you get something in your eye, a chemical or such, we have three different locations of eye wash stations. This is our first one here, and I'll just demonstrate, give it a little push, and you've got a nice flow of water. That's quite a lot of water that's going to be going into your eye, and you have to do that for 15 to 20 minutes. So you probably don't want to get something in your eye to begin with, but you especially don't want to because you probably don't want to do that for 15 to 20 minutes. All right, let me just show you where the other ones are. So that one's at the end of our first lab bench. The next one, I was cleaning the table, so I've got all my soap there. Next one's right here. Also has the 4 different spouts going on. Okay, and then all the way in the back of our third table is our last eye wash station right here. Okay, this one just has 2 prongs, but it gets the job done. Ooh, and it hadn't been run for a while, so that was pretty gross. Okay, so in addition to our eye wash stations, you also want to know where some other key components of our lab safety are, and that's going to be our glass storage, our glass disposal, I mean. So if something breaks, and by if I mean when something breaks, and you need to clean it up, usually I will help you do that. But if you end up doing it, you need to know where the glass disposal is. Our other one is way over there next to the large jug. Okay. All right, that's our our glass disposal. Next, let's look around here. Oh, look, we've got a nice little drain on the ground. I wonder what that's for. That's because we have our first of our 2 safety showers right here. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate this one because it is in the middle of the room, but safety showers are here if you get large quantities, especially on your clothes, and you need to rinse that off. This is obviously in an emergency, but if that happens, you come over here, pull the lever, tons of water is going to come crashing down. Everybody else will be leaving the room, give you a little bit of privacy so that you can rinse off and make sure everything's good. Okay. Just as a side note, this is where our Bunsen burners are stored. Make sure you notice we've got the Bunsen burners in, the tubes out, just to keep it nice and organized. All right, let's keep going. Okay. Next up, you'll notice this large thing in the front of the room, okay, as you see my reflection. Okay, I'll get out of there. All right, so this is called a fume hood, and this fume hood has a couple things going on. First, it has lovely lights, but also a switch. Now listen carefully, and if you can't tell, there's a fan that just turned on. This fume hood draws the air up, out, and it just shoots it outside. That way you can do experiments in there that maybe produce a gas that might be a little toxic and that you don't want to have to deal with in the classroom itself. We do have 2 fume hoods going on, one on the left and one on the right. Okay, these are mostly used for demonstrations that I do. Okay. Last section here, well, there's the glass disposal. Okay, this is demineralized or deionized water that we will use for the lab if we get to do the labs. Okay, and we've got this nice little space. This is where you first walk into the room, and we've got a few little things here. We've got our fire extinguisher and our fire blanket. Okay, so fire extinguisher, obviously, you would point at the base of the fire, pull the pin, squeeze and shoot, right? And then our fire blanket. Fire requires three things. It requires fuel, oxygen, and heat. So by using this fire blanket, you're helping to smother the flame, and by doing that, you're removing some of the oxygen, okay? Next up, we've got the prep room. Now, the prep room is for me, okay? You guys will never need to go in here, so it is off limits. But just to sate your curiosity, I'll just show you what it looks like in here. Okay, so we've got all sorts of chemicals. Now, what this video doesn't show you is that it has quite the distinct chemical smell, so you probably wouldn't want to spend a lot of time in here anyways. So there's your one and only glimpse of the chemical stockroom. And lastly, there's the door, okay, that you would come in. Lastly, this is our other safety shower. Okay, this one is in a nice little alcove. So obviously in an emergency, you're going to go to the closest one. But if you had to pick, this one would probably be the best way to do it. So I'm going to demonstrate this just so that you get to see exactly how much water is coming out. So I got to be very careful. Here we go. Voila, a lot of water. So with the safety shower, like the eye wash station, you would want to make sure that everything is completely rinsed off. Okay? Now we're going to talk about the lab equipment and stuff that you might be using in the lab. Okay, so we're going to be learning about all the different equipment, the glassware, the instruments, tools that we might use in our chemistry classroom. Of course, this year it's a little bit different and we might not actually get to use these, but I thought it'd still be a good idea to introduce you to these so you'd know the names and the functions. So I'd highly recommend in your notebooks where you're taking your notes, have a section and use a little creativity. Draw these, maybe print out some pictures and tape them in there so that you know what they look like and what their function is. So for each item, I'm going to tell you what it's called and what it's used for, and then you will be responsible for drawing or getting a picture of them. Okay, so let's go ahead and start. First off, our most common item in the lab is going to be our beaker. That's B-E-A-K-E-R, beaker. So these are probably the most multifunctional tool that we have in the lab because it holds things really well. Now you'll notice they do have lines on them, markings, and I've actually got a couple different sizes here. Okay, we've got different sizes. Aw, look at this one. It's so cute. Okay, so we've got markings on them, but these are really not the best tool to use for taking the volume of things. But in general, beakers are used for holding things, storing, mixing, doing reactions in. So you can really just say it's a versatile holding device. It's also very good for pouring, I think is what you'll see them used for, pouring liquids. So that's our beaker. Next up, we've got this really odd shaped one. Okay, these have a nice large base to them and a narrow opening. This is called an Erlenmeyer flask. Erlenmeyer, let's see, E-R-L-E-N-M-E-Y-E-R, I believe, or you can just Google it. Okay, so Erlenmeyer flasks, and you'll notice it does have this weird shape. So what do you think? If we've got a large base, but a small opening, what might that be useful for? We can store liquids, it's got markings, but in this case, the best use for these is for mixing. We've got that large base, small opening, so stuff's not going to splash out, so we can do lots of mixing with our Erlenmeyer flasks. One of the less common pieces of glassware that we'll be using is this guy right here. Okay, it has a very creative name. Okay, this is called a round bottom flask. Okay, yay. Very creative, I know. This is just another type of glassware that we can use in a, let's see, it's part of a larger setup a lot of times, but this is just good for holding and doing reactions in. So this one's not as important, but it's called a round bottom flask. Next one you've probably all seen before, our good old test tube. Okay, this is good for mixing several milliliters of liquid. Okay, so we had our Erlenmeyer flask, which was good for mixing large quantities. Our test tubes are good for mixing smaller quantities and doing a little reactions in as well. You'll notice this one's a little dirty. You'd probably want to wash it before you use it. Okay, yep, there's our test tube. Let's keep going down our table. And we've got a few pieces here that are sort of funky. First of all, you should all know what this is. This is just a funnel. Okay, it's good for pouring liquids through, especially into small items like test tubes or Erlenmeyer flasks. It's for funneling. Yay, so that one's standard. This next one though, this one, it's like a little bowl. Now this is made of ceramic, so it can be heated up, but usually what this is going to be used for is evaporating things, which is why we call this an evaporating dish. So we can put a solution in here and we can heat it up, and when we heat it up, the little crystals and any solids are going to be left behind. So this is our evaporating dish. Next up is our little piece of glass here. Now I like to call this a Giant's contact lens because it is sort of convex, right? Or concave, depending on which way you're looking at it. This is actually just called a watch glass, and it's another one of those multifunctional tools that we've got in our chemist tool bag. It's mostly used for observing reactions. So we can just put a few little drops of a chemical, maybe solid, and we can see what happens on that. One extra thing though is that these can often be used to cover our beakers if we need to do that for some reason. Okay. All right, so that's our watch glass. Next one is actually my least favorite in all of the tools that we've got. This is called a well plate, or a spot plate, or a reaction plate. And it's because it's got all these little wells, okay, these little reaction places where we can do little drops, okay? So this is good for mixing drops of solutions, drops of mixtures. So we had Erlenmeyer for large, test tubes for small. This is best for mixing just drops of solutions and observing lots of reactions right next to each other. So why do I not like this piece of equipment? Well, that would be because it makes a terrible noise. Now, we won't have this problem as much, but if there's 7 lab groups and they all have well plates and they're screeching, it gets to be a little bit loud. So just be careful if you're ever handling these, because they're annoying. Next up, we've got a few other pieces of glassware, some familiar ones here. Of course, we've got our graduated cylinders. We've got small ones, we've got big ones. I've got much bigger ones too, but those are a little bit more expensive. So these are called graduated cylinders because they are graduated. No, they didn't go to high school and get their diploma. They are graduated because they have these markings. Each of these lines is called a graduation. So this is our 100 ml graduated cylinder. And this is what we're going to be using to measure volumes. This is a little bit more precise than things like our beakers and our Erlenmeyers because of all of these markings. Now, a reminder, when we're taking the readings of things like graduated cylinders, we are going to base it off of sig figs. So we've got markings every one. So you'll notice every little mark there is 1 milliliter, which means when I write my answer, I need to estimate one place past. So if I thought it was like right here, okay, hard to see there, but let's say that's there, that would be in between 47 and 48. I wouldn't say just 47 or 48. I'd have to say 47.6 or something like that. So we're definitely going to have to learn how to use sig figs properly, which is going to be in a future video that you'll be watching. Okay, so those are for measuring volumes. Sometimes if we need to get exact volumes in our graduated cylinder, we can use something like our little pipette. Okay, we can just draw some liquid up and drop it out. Okay. Next one is a piece of glassware that you guys will probably never use, And you might say, oh, we've already seen this piece of glassware. No, you haven't. This is not a round bottom flask. This is what we call a volumetric flask. Volumetric flask. And the reason it's called volumetric is, if you notice right here, okay, on the neck of our flask, there's one line. That one line is exactly 250 milliliters within 0.24 milliliters, plus or minus 0.24. So this is for exactly 250. This is used for preparing solutions. So if I know it's 250 milliliters exactly, I add my solid in here, and then I add the liquid, my water, usually up to the line, and then I've got a known concentration of my substance. I'll talk more about those when we deal with concentrations. Next up, we've got our thermometer, of course, in degrees Celsius, right? Metric is the best. So we've got our degrees Celsius, and then we've also got our digital thermometer probe here. So you just take off the little white cap, and then you stick it in here. Now, I will say the digital probes can be a little finicky sometimes, so often I just go with the classic analog thermometer. Okay, next up, we've got a few little tools here. First one is just a glass stick, but we don't call it a glass stick. We call this a glass stirring rod, and it is used for stirring things. Another very versatile tool. Next up, we've got our balance here. This is used for measuring masses, but in order to measure masses, sometimes we need a few other tools. So this is what we call a weigh boat, like how much do you weigh boat. So we put that on there, and we can zero it out, okay? A lot of times we have to push this 0 button, okay? And then we can scoop it in there. But a lot of times these chemicals are dangerous. We don't want to use our hands, so we need a few little tools. So I've got a little spatula, a little scraper type thing right here. We call this a spatula. And then we've also got this thing, which has got a really fun name. This is used for scooping. We call this a scoopula. Scoopula. S-C-O-O-P-U-L-A. Scoopula. And if we've got solids, we can sometimes use these. You might say, oh, look, we've got some nice tweezers. Well, this is chemistry. We like to give things fancy names, so we don't call these tweezers. We call these forceps. F-O-R-C-E-P-S. Forceps. So, yes, they're essentially tweezers that we can use to pick stuff up, but we give it a fancy name. Okay? Moving on. Next up, we've got this little thing. This might look a little familiar. You might think, oh, we use this to make medicines and stuff. This is called a mortar and pestle. Okay, mortar, M-O-R-T-A-R, and pestle, P-E-S-T-L-E. Okay, and this is used for grinding and crushing chemicals, right? Increasing surface area, and otherwise just grinding it up. Okay, a lot of fun to use. Let's keep going. Okay, now we've got a fancy setup here. We've got our Bunsen burner, which is, of course, fire. Okay, we'll talk more about that later on. But we've got this little device for putting stuff on. So let me see if I can back up here a little bit. Okay, you can't really see too well, but there we go. So this right here is what we call a ring stand. So this whole base is called a ring stand. Okay, it's got this iron ring attached to it, which is helpful for when we need to heat things up. But there's a few little setups that we need here. So first of all, if we're just heating up a beaker or something, we need something like this, because just the ring itself isn't going to hold it. If I grab my beaker here, right, there's nothing there to hold it. So we're going to use this, we call it wire gauze. Wire gauze, it's this little wire mesh, and it's got a little ceramic piece to help distribute heat evenly. That's what our wire gauze is for. So our wire gauze, and then we can set our beaker on top. Okay? So that can be used for beakers, that can be used for Erlenmeyer flasks and so forth, anything. But we've got one other tool here. This is also made of ceramic, meaning that it can be heated up to very high temperatures. No, it's not a little honey pot. This is what we call a crucible. Crucibles are used for heating substances, usually solids, to very high temperatures. So we've got this little lid, right? And I've got a little surprise in here. Another lid, because we have Aw, look at it. It's a little baby one. Okay, so our crucibles are used to heat stuff up to very high temperatures, but since they're already made of ceramic, we actually don't use the wire gauze with this. We use this, which is called, very creatively, a clay triangle. Wow. So what happens, this sets on top, and our crucible just sits right on the top of that. However, whenever you're heating this up, I wouldn't want to touch that crucible, which is why we've got these guys right here. These are called crucible tongs. They are used for grabbing our crucibles, but you'll notice it has sort of a slight plus type opening, type gap. That's so that we can actually just grab it on either side. Let me just turn it so you can see. Grab it on either side so it just rests in that little spot. Okay, yeah, this crucible's a little bit messy, isn't it? Okay, so it's very hot. Sometimes you want to use two hands if you want, that's fine. Okay, but the great thing about this is that we've got these little pieces that come together. Okay, what do you think those are used for? Well, they're for the lid, right? We can grab this lid and put it on top. Ta-da! So these are crucible tongs. Well, what about our beakers then? What if I want to heat up my beaker? Well, we can use our Bunsen burner to heat stuff up, but I have a few other pieces of equipment here. My last one, this is going to be our hot plate. We call this our hot plate. It's plug in and it starts heating things up. So you can just put it right on there. Okay. But if I want to pick up my beaker, I'll probably want some beaker tongs. Okay, these you'll notice have a nice wide opening. It's much nicer to actually hold on to the beaker. This works all the way up to the largest size, but it can be a little bit nerve-wracking if you're picking up a giant beaker. So you always want to be extra careful when handling hot glassware. Okay. Last item, we heated up beakers, we heated up crucibles. What about our test tubes? Right? Test tubes we're not going to be able to hold with our crucible tongs. Right? It doesn't fit. Okay? Definitely won't fit in our beaker tongs. So we're going to need a test tube holder. Okay? We've got test tube holder versus test tube rack. That's our last item there. Test tube rack is just for holding it, but our test tube holders, right, are for actually securing our test tube. Now you'll notice there's something pretty cool about our test tube holders here, and that is they hold themselves. Notice how it's sort of spring-loaded here. So it actually opens when I squeeze, and when I let go, it closes. That way I don't have to worry about accidentally crushing the test tube. Okay. Now I wheeled myself over here to my Bunsen burner because this is where we would actually be heating up our test tube, right? So we would, with our Bunsen burner, we would heat it up, and remember our safety, right? We don't want to heat it up towards ourselves. That's a bad idea. You don't want to heat it up towards your neighbor Sally, right? Even if you don't like her. Okay, we are going to point it away from anybody, okay? Towards the middle or anywhere, okay? And a lot of times you want to move it in the flame so that you don't heat it up too rapidly, okay? So, this has been an overview of all the different equipment and glassware. We'll see if we actually get to use this, but there you go. Make sure you fill in your notes. Let me know if you have questions.